All right, without further ado, we're going to start our last panel. This panel is titled The Future of Bioenergy. I'm Jerome Fox. I'm a graduate student in chemical engineering, studying converting the kinetics of converting biomass to sugars. And I'm just starting out, so I am still naive and not yet jaded. I will basically just introduce to you our moderator of our panel and just tell you who we have here, and then Will, our moderator, will take it from there. So Will Coleman is a partner at Moore Davidow Ventures. He specializes in energy and clean tech investments. Prior to coming out here, he worked in DC as the legislative director for the Renewable Energy Action Project. He basically worked on building state-level coalitions of biofuel producers, marketers, and environmental groups. He then proceeded to do numerous consulting jobs and other jobs with companies that have the name energy or environment or green somewhere in the title. He then came out to California, where he was invited to be on the California Energy Commission Biofuels Working Group, which had the goal of reducing the state's dependence on petroleum. Will has been a great resource to BERC. He helped found this group, as well as the Center for Energy and Environmental Innovation. He got his bachelor's degree from Harvard, his MBA from Haas, and he also got a master's degree of science in the Energy and Resources group, studying, I think, the feasibility of converting algae, of using algae to create biofuels. So I'm going to turn it over to Will, and he's going to put this panel in context and then introduce the panelists, and we'll be off.
Good afternoon. It's really a privilege to be up here for a lot of reasons. First, I think I'm the only person on the stage that doesn't have doctor before their name or hasn't published 150 different publications. So I just want to briefly talk about the fact that we have an amazing breadth and depth of people here, ranging from Chris Somerville and Blake Simmons, who are two of the top scientists in microbiology and have been focused on this area for a long, long time, to Doug Cameron, who has been in the academic arena before and is also one of the top scientists, early scientists in this space, and now works as an investor for Coastal Ventures, which is arguably the most involved or the most active fund in the biofuel space. And Madhu Khanna, who has spent her entire career focused on agricultural and market issues related to biofuels and other agricultural challenges. So we're basically going to spend 5 to 10 minutes for each panelist going through their background and some of the things that they're working on, and then go into a moderated session and then obviously break into Q&A for everyone. But I just wanted to start briefly with about 3 minutes of very, very basic slides about the background of biofuels. And the first is just a quote. And I'm sort of curious if anybody in this audience actually knows where this quote came from. Think about it for a second, but essentially what it's saying is the fuel of the future is going to come from all the things around us, from biomass essentially. Came from Henry Ford in 1925. And I think the point is that biofuels have been around for a long, long time, and it's been a long, long process for most of the evolution of biofuels in terms of competing with incumbents and competing with the political challenges of actually getting biofuels and bioenergy into the marketplace. And just to follow up on that, in 1908, you saw your first flex fuel vehicle. It was the Model T. It was designed to use both gasoline and ethanol, and a combination of the two. In 1918, you saw ethanol fuel consumption go up to 60 million gallons a year. Then a funny thing happened, which was prohibition. And one of the leading proponents of prohibition happened to be J.D. Rockefeller. And what you can see happens as you sort of follow on in the following time frames is ethanol fuel production drops down to 0. Now, there were a lot of other things that were driving that. But I think it was sort of the first example of food versus fuel, and maybe it was more just fuel versus fuel as food or whatever you want to call it, but either way it was banned. And then the phase out of lead in the early 70s led to a resurgence of ethanol. You saw new incentives in 79 and an increase to 60 million gallons a year. And then ethanol blends were signified in the Clean Air Act of 1991, and you saw a takeoff of the production levels. So, but the interesting thing is 10 years later, when you saw markets begin to open again because of MTBE, it was still only at about 1 billion gallons a year. And it really was at that point that you started to see ethanol take hold in the marketplace. And you know, I think it's important just because it has taken this long to get to a point where ethanol was something that was actually a significant portion of the market. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of them are technological, and that's what a lot of this panel is going to be focused on. Some of them are market, which we're also going to focus on. But I think that as we look at where we are today, which is that we have 7.8 billion gallons of ethanol now being produced and consumed in the United States. Biodiesel is a much smaller fraction, but it's still just a tiny fraction of the overall US fuel consumption, so it's 3%. And the target under the RFS for 2020 is to get that up to 10%, 50% of which will be advanced biofuels. So 15 billion gallons a year will be advanced biofuels. That's a pretty heavy burden, and part of the question today is, are we going to be able to actually get there, and how do we do that? But there's another thing to consider, which is that there's been a lot of debate about whether or not biofuels are a good thing. And that tends to focus on corn ethanol. But if you look at biofuels today, it's not just about corn ethanol anymore. This is an eye chart, and I expect about 5% of you to actually be able to read this, but on the left side, if you could read it, on the left side you'd see a whole bunch of feedstocks. And on the right side, you would see a whole bunch of products, everything from ethanol to alkanes to other intermediates. And in the middle, you see a lot of different pathways to get from feedstocks to products. And the jury is still out on which of these pathways will be successful. And that's part of the research that's going on here at Berkeley and elsewhere, and it's part of what these startups are focused on doing these days. But I think that one of the questions that we have to kind of consider is, amidst the debate about corn ethanol, that we wouldn't even really be looking at this chart or have this panel here if it weren't for the market that was created by corn ethanol. You probably wouldn't have the investment in the space in terms of R&D. You certainly wouldn't have the investment from the venture community because you simply wouldn't have a market to be investing towards. So I think we just have to think about, good or bad, how these industries evolve and how long it takes. And be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when we're talking about things like advanced biofuels. So with that in mind, we're going to dive into our panel. And our first panelist is Professor Madhu Khanna, who has been active in this space for a long, long time. She's a professor from the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She received her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. So she's a local, which is great. And she spends most of her research examining the effectiveness and targeting of alternative market-based instruments and voluntary approaches for inducing the adoption of environmentally friendly technologies. I'm not going to dig too much more into her bio, you can read it, but suffice to say she's been funded by a wide range of government entities and other foundations and has an extremely accomplished career in this space. So please welcome Madhu Khanna.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and talk today. I'm, as you heard, an economist, and what I'd like to do is just start by providing a context for some of the research that we are doing at Illinois and at Berkeley under the EBI. In particular, what we are observing is, with growing incomes, growing populations, is a growing demand both for food as well as for fuel. And at the same time, we are facing a exhaustible or constrained supply of oil, which is in some ways responsible for the rising prices that we are observing. There's also increasing concern about climate change and the need to move away from fossil fuels towards other types of renewable energy. There's the concern for energy security and the hope that we can reduce our dependence on energy that we're obtaining from some of the Middle Eastern countries. All of that is fueling this interest in moving towards domestic sources and renewable sources of energy. And it has also created a demand for land, which was previously being used for food production. We're now interested in using the same land for producing energy. We're also interested in using that land for storing carbon. Soils provide a major sink for carbon. We also have forests that are storing carbon, and so that limits the amount of land that we want to be able to take away from their existing uses under forests or as grasslands and so on, and convert them into cropland or convert them into land that's being used to grow energy crops. So there's a limited amount of land, and we're trying to figure out how to optimally use that for at least 3 different uses, which is for energy provision, food, and for storing carbon. And that's where there's a major role for technology in being able to design methods and techniques that we can get more out of that land, more amount of energy, more food, and so on. And there's also a role for policy that would provide the right incentives so that we achieve that optimal balance of using the land in these multiple uses. Our current approach, as we are where we are today, is very much focused towards increasing the supply of liquid fuels, and for a variety of reasons that I don't want to get into. But we have a renewable fuels mandate under the recent Energy Policy Act, which sets a goal of 36 billion gallons to be produced from, in the form of biofuels by 2022. And a considerable portion of that, about 15 billion gallons, would be produced from corn ethanol. Even if we are able to achieve that goal, that still represents a relatively small proportion of our gasoline consumption today, and an even smaller portion of the amount that we are importing. To achieve that 15 billion gallons of biofuels from corn would require us using about half of the corn that we're currently producing for feed and food towards energy production. And then in addition, we'd need to use more land to achieve the rest of the target, which would presumably come from biofuels. So there's an increasing competition for land that we're going to be observing, and with all of its ramifications for the potential to raise food prices, reduce the exports of corn, and so on, and have an implication for developing countries. So this heavy reliance that we currently have on using food-based crops, particularly corn, for producing ethanol, is of course going to reduce our production for food, reduce our exports. There's already an increasing shift in land from corn production, from soybeans and wheat towards corn production. We've had an unprecedented amount of acres shift from soybean and wheat towards corn production, and despite that, the price of corn has more than doubled. It's about $5 per bushel, where it used to be about $2 just a couple of years ago. There's also additional impacts, which are the environmental impacts of increasing reliance on corn production for energy, which is that corn is very, very heavy in its fertilizer requirements, and there is the increased amount of nitrogen that will be used, and all of the potential problems in terms of nitrogen runoff and hypoxia in the Gulf and so on that are likely to get further exacerbated as we continue down this path. Corn ethanol has a potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions relative to gasoline, but relatively by a small amount, and that amount differs according to studies, but would be typically about 12 to 20%. So there is some potential, but the bigger concern that's been raised is the fact that when we reduce the amount of corn that's available for food and feed in the US, that is going to create an incentive for other countries around the world to increase their production of these crops and other crops that are being substituted out as well. And when they do that, they're likely to be cutting down some forests and plowing up the grasslands and so on, and releasing carbon that has been stored in those ecosystems for decades and centuries, and in the process, that may more than offset any benefit we might get from reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. by a small fraction by using ethanol. And so the net impact in terms of the greenhouse gas benefits are a little bit unclear. Of course, there's a need for a lot more data and a lot more research in order to get a better handle on it, but that is the likely scenario. And so we really need to be thinking about alternative ways in which we can increase our renewable fuel production without having some of these negative, or at least minimizing the negative effects that we are likely to see under our current approach. And that's where dedicated energy crops come into the picture. And in particular, two crops that have shown some promise in terms of their yields and their ability to be grown under diverse conditions, and something that can be easily adapted on croplands by using existing equipment and so on, are switchgrass and miscanthus. And this picture that you see is from one of the experimental fields at Illinois, where they've been growing both of these crops in a way to better understand the agronomic practices and their yields and so on. Miscanthus is a perennial with something like a 20-year lifetime, and it's the taller of the two grasses. It grows to a height of about 14, 15 feet. It is almost three times more productive in terms of the amount of biomass that would be available per acre of land, requires very little by way of nitrogen and other inputs, and has a great deal more of energy that can be used for producing ethanol. So in terms of the amount of gallons per acre that one would get with these alternative types of feedstocks that are within the realm of what's available, you could see that the amount that you could get from miscanthus would be more than double what you could get currently per acre of land from ethanol, and even more than what one would get even from switchgrass. So in terms of being able to use our land as efficiently as we can to produce energy, clearly that would be a direction one would like to go, so that we have to displace the smallest amount of land from crop production. And in order to meet this 36 billion gallon target, one would need something like 40 million acres of land instead of about 100 million acres if we were to go just with corn production. That 40 million acres, of course, we would still be displacing, but we have the potential to use some of the existing land that is currently under the Conservation Reserve Program, for example, which is retired land for environmental purposes that could be used to grow energy crops such as miscanthus, which has many of the environmental benefits from the current permanent grasses that are being grown on CRP land in any case. So that would be one way that we might be able to get more energy without necessarily taking as much land out of crop production as we currently are planning to do. In terms of CO2 emissions as well, relative to gasoline, as I said, corn ethanol reduces it by about 15 to 20%. Even if we include some of the sequestration that might happen, it might be as much as 25%. But miscanthus actually has a much greater potential, could reduce emissions by 90% relative to relative to gasoline. And if we include the sequestration benefits that come along with growing such a perennial grass, then in fact it could be a sink for carbon. But there are many barriers to the use of cellulosic ethanol on a commercial level at the moment, and one of them is the fact that we've got very limited experience with growing these types of energy crops on a large scale in a way that we can ensure the quality and standardize the production methods and so on. So there's a lot, some ways to go in terms of that. The costs of growing them, the costs of delivering them are still quite high. And the current work that's being undertaken is really to improve the yields even further, to develop varieties that enhance the yield even more, as well as figuring out the engineering and the economics so that we can reduce the costs of harvesting this, which are going to be enormous, the cost of transporting this to the refineries and storing it, because this is harvested once a year. It has to be stored for the rest of the year before while it's being used, so there are considerable costs over there. And so that's the areas where research is needed and is being undertaken. We also have to find cost-effective ways to commercially convert this cellulosic material into liquid fuels, and that we still don't have that. At the same time, we need policy. So in addition to technology, there's a major role that policy has to play here in order to provide the right incentives so that the producers of these biofuels get compensated in some ways for some of the environmental benefits that are likely to be generated by producing cellulosic instead of corn ethanol. And those would be, for example, the types of climate policies or a cap on carbon emissions that would lead to a price for carbon that would obviously go in favor and improve the competitiveness of a low-carbon fuel like miscanthus, as well as conservation policies that would reward the production of perennials for the carbon sequestration benefits, their ability to reduce nitrogen runoff, soil erosion, and so on, as compared to corn. So just very quickly, in terms of some of the socioeconomic and environmental concerns that come up, and those are the areas that we're working on under the EBI, are, well, in order to achieve this with a variety of these feedstocks that are likely to be feasible in the near future, how much land is likely to be required, what type of feedstocks, what mix of feedstocks would be needed, and where should we grow them, which areas of the country should we be growing what types of feedstock. What is the implication of all of this going to be for food prices in the US and for developing countries? How much is our trade going to be affected? And therefore, what is the world market going to look like? What is the effect on consumers, both in the US as well as in other countries? And what are the trade-offs we are likely to see between higher food prices and possibly a little lower fuel prices? And as well as looking at what are the environmental effects. And so some of the current research is very preliminary and very investigative in terms of how much sequestration can actually be achieved with these crops. We really need much more data on a wider scale before we can have any conclusions about what are the environmental benefits going to be with alternative types of feedstocks. And then think about designing the appropriate types of policies. What is the appropriate climate policy, the energy policy, and the conservation policy, and how these three policies should be working together rather than as standalone things, which might lead to these mixed messages that are going out, so that we can actually achieve a sustainable bioenergy production. Very quickly, in terms of what my perspective on where we are heading in terms of the research undertaken by the EBI and how I see what the vision of the EBI is to really take a holistic view all the way from the beginning of that process where we're looking at the types of feedstocks and the types of energy crops one should be investigating to the methods that are going to be used or available or for fuel production. So taking a view of that entire chain with all options really on the table. And so it's a very open-minded research process. Knowing that this is such a complex problem and recognizing that one has to do this is an interdisciplinary activity, there is an attempt to facilitate that type of interdisciplinary research where economists and agronomists and engineers are working together in finding solutions that are workable and really looking not only at the science but also the social science of this particular issue, so that we can come up with better solutions that would inform decision makers and lead to better policies. And in some ways, this really represents a very novel approach towards an industry and university partnership towards solving a complex societal problem. So I'm going to stop with that, and I know that Chris is going to lead off with more on the vision of the EBI.
So next up, we have Chris Somerville, who is the director of the Energy Biosciences Institute and a faculty member at the Plant and Microbial Biology Department at Berkeley. we were lucky enough to woo a portion of Chris's time away from Stanford. You know, I should note that a few weeks ago I was at a conference that Chris was at, and he was just sitting, he did present, but at the time he was just sitting in the audience. I think 60% of the people there noted that it was just a privilege to be there because he was there. So he's truly been a titan in this industry, I guess, in this space. It's not really, it's an industry and a research area, but so I'd just like to welcome Chris Somerville.
Well, it was very fascinating to hear Madhu talk because she's an economist, and you don't see economists talking about crop science and agriculture every day. And I think her talk was really music to my ears because it reflects the challenge in the field. That is that we have a very multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary challenge to try and integrate a lot of different subjects. I thought what I would do is just add a few words to what she said and just sort of provide a brief overview of what we're doing in the Energy Bioscience Institute. As this slide shows, and I think it's widely known here, that the EBI is a partnership with the University of Illinois, LBL, and BP. We have actually, of the 500 million is frequently discussed, but the amount that's actually available to us for academic work is 350 million. And the mandate is actually not biofuels, but it's a much broader mandate to explore the application of knowledge about biological processes to the energy sector. We do have a large focus right now on biofuels and bioenergy and on carbon sequestration because, as Madhu noted, most of the carbon in the biosphere is in the soils, and so one of our rules is that whatever we do must not disturb the soil carbon. We also, however, have some interest in the application to enhanced oil recovery and bioprocessing. I think that in the earlier session there was a discussion about the fact that recovering oil from tar sands, for example, releases about 3 times or I shouldn't put a number on it, but very large amounts of energy because basically they burn natural gas to melt the oil out of the sand. And one of our hopes is that we may be able to develop new technologies for separating oil and sand that don't require such huge energy inputs. In the context of biofuels, our priorities are listed here. There's basically 5 things. One is to enable feedstock production, and I think Madhu did a really great job of describing some of the issues there. We also need to make better catalysts for the conversion of biomass to sugars and conceivably for hydrolysis of lignin. We need to make better industrial microorganisms to ferment all the sugars. Having said that, we also are very interested in actually synthetic chemical routes for conversion of sugars to fuels. So we're not making a bet on a biological conversion. We're also in parallel examining a true chemical conversion. We're interested in new types of fuels. I think we don't see ethanol as necessarily the long-term biofuel. We think that something that looks more like an existing fuel has many advantages. And that was also discussed in the earlier session where it was noted that there's a huge infrastructure around the fuel systems that would be extremely expensive to replace. 240 million cars in this country alone, of which only about 5 million will burn more than 10% ethanol. And finally, as Madhu noted, we have quite a large effort in understanding the social, economic, and environmental implications of biofuels because I think no one involved in EBI wants to participate in something that's not going in a good direction socially and environmentally. The technical reach of this is actually vast. This is how we sort of see the organization of the EBI. You can see that there's in the green bucket are sort of what we consider the feedstock aspects of it, which actually Madhu did a great job of summarizing. In the yellow bucket is the sort of technologies for converting feedstocks to what we might call fuel precursors, that is generally hydrolyzing biomass to sugars. And then in the blue bucket is the technologies that we're interested in for conversion of sugars, generally sugars to fuels of varying kinds. So we're supporting about 50 research groups now at Berkeley and Illinois, and it's probably known here that we arrived there by inviting the faculty at the 3 partner institutions to propose their ideas to us in short 3-page proposals with no budgets, just concept papers. We received 250 such proposals involving, we estimate, about 700 faculty members. And so it was really a rewarding process in that a lot of good ideas were put forward, and we then convened a faculty panel of about 15 faculty members to try and sort through all the ideas. In the first case, only based on whether they were a good fit to the goals that we had posted, which we adopted actually from a Department of Energy study. And then with the 85 proposals that we liked from the 250 that were proposed, we invited full detailed proposals with budgets and timelines and milestones and sent those all off campus around the world for peer review. And we brought back all the peer reviews and convened 3 more panels to review them for technical competence. And at the end of that, we were happy with, we ended up funding 50 different groups. And I'm happy to say you can now go onto the EBI website and read 2-page summaries of all 50 things that we funded. So you can get a really good sense of it. And the fact that you can do that actually reflects a commitment we have to trying to be open. So EBI research, although it's sponsored by a big company, is actually, we're really fortunate to be able to implement it in a way that, in which there's no secrecy, and we hope that we can, you know, of course, all the results will be published, and our goal is to actually be a resource for not just for BP, but for the whole community, for the world. Because I think most of the people, or perhaps all the people that are involved in this, are actually motivated by trying to make a difference in what we see as a really large problem, which of course is... This slide, by the way, shows what we call the spending rule. So although in order to sort of manage the resources, one of the things we did was that the group of, we have 8 faculty members that are sort of an executive committee that manages the EBI, and 1 vice president from BP. And as a group, we prioritized the different topics and tried to come up with how much of our resources should we allocate to different topics. And this pie chart sort of shows roughly where it is, so you can see that about 14% is going towards socioeconomic work, and I don't know, 8% is going towards fossil and so on. So it gives you some sense, and in managing it, we try to allocate resources to the spending rule. So even if we got 1,000 proposals in socioeconomic work, we would only be able to use 14% of the resources towards that topic, and we prioritize accordingly. So, so the work is just beginning. We're of course trying to bring as many of the groups together as we can into several spaces we have here at Berkeley and at Illinois. And our goal in bringing together some of the larger groups that we're funding are to try and get the synergies across disciplines that we think are required to make progress in understanding this issue. And if I had to describe what our overriding goal is, I would say our overriding goal is to compose an organization that can see every aspect of biofuels, from farm implement design on one extreme to political science and socioeconomics on the other, with a lot of chemical engineering and microbiology in the middle. And we think that seeing the whole picture will be a unique resource, because so far there are very few other groups around the world that are resourced to look at all the components at the same time. And I really loved Madhu's talk because she actually did the kind of integration that we're looking for, in which we have economists, for example, who can understand what's coming in agronomy, and also are talking to chemical engineers and know what the chemical engineers are trying to accomplish and what they think the technical innovation will be, so that we get a forward-looking analysis of what we might accomplish with innovation in the various areas. And I think that will be a very valuable decision-making tool for hopefully the whole community as we go forward. I think I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
So next up, we have Blake Simmons, who is one of the leaders of the other major effort in this area at Berkeley, which is the Joint Bioenergy Institute. Blake is the Vice President of Deconstruction, which sounds a little ominous, but it's actually just focusing on breaking down the lignocellulosic materials into usable sugar monomers. He also is the manager of the Energy Systems Department at the Sandia National Laboratory, and has also been a very active participant in this space for a long, long time. So please welcome Blake.
I'd just like to give my thanks again for the committee and inviting me out here and to stand up on stage with Chris and some other good friends on describing some of the excitement and some of the innovation that we hope to achieve in the realm of biofuels over the coming years. And my message here is basically to give you an introduction to the Joint Bioenergy Institute. And again, I have the distinctive title of the Vice President for Deconstruction, but I'm a really nice guy. Don't hold that against me. Although I did grow up in Nebraska, so I have a deep, abiding love-hate relationship with corn. And you'll see that manifest as we move along into the presentation about kind of our approaches in moving beyond corn ethanol and actually moving beyond ethanol. And it's really good to follow Chris in the EBI presentation because you'll see there's a nice, the parallels are there. The problem statements are still the same, but our approach between the two centers are very much different. And I think there's going to be a nice synergy that exists between the co-location of EBI and JBEI that we'll be able to take advantage for the coming years. So I don't want to belabor the point because I think we've gone over this quite a bit, and it is Friday late in the afternoon, and it is getting time to drink some ethanol perhaps as opposed to talking about it. But I just want to point out that there are global energy security and environmental concerns that we need to address. And whether you view the conversation as coming from the national energy security standpoint or the global energy standpoint or the environmental perspective, it still comes down to this. We need to find a way to solve some of the problems we're facing with our reliance on fossil fuels. And that's pretty much the core mantra that we're trying to manifest here with the JBEI. So we have a growing demand for energy and a finite availability of the feedstocks which feed that demand. We need to find solutions that are more sustainable and more realistic. And those feed into things such as conservation and other alternative technologies in not developing a silver bullet, as we heard earlier today, but perhaps a silver shotgun, that we have multiple solutions to multiple problems and get away from the one feedstock, one fuel debate. So reliance on coal conversion is also another important thing that we heard about a lot today, and clean coal not being necessarily a good outcome, even if it is living up to its projected gains in carbon sequestration. We still need to take that with a grain of salt. And if you take a look at some of the other published reports on the CO2 emissions and the growing trends in global warming, this is also a very alarming thing that we need to address. And so there's been a growing endeavor around the idea that biomass can be used to develop biofuels to supplant the reliance on fossil fuels. And biomass conversion offers the potential for a more carbon neutral fuel and a more environmentally friendly and energy friendly fuel than what we're using today. So DOE came out with a report that was called Breaking the Barriers to Lignocellulosic Ethanol and Lignocellulosic Biofuels. And the realization of that report was basically the establishment of 3 bioenergy research centers that were just awarded back in, I believe it was June in 2007. Funding started in October 1 of 2007. The 3 centers are, the first is the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, and that's led by University of Wisconsin-Madison. The second is the Bioenergy Science Center with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory as the lead. And then the third is the Joint Bioenergy Institute. And the lead institution in that endeavor was Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. And they are all funded at the same level of $135 million with the same period of performance of 5 years. And the initiative here and DOE's rationale behind it was to really support high-risk, high-return research to develop new solutions to realize the biomass to biofuel conversion pipeline. Now, ostensibly, that was around ethanol. Most of the replacement fuels that we're talking about have all been geared around ethanol production and finding a cellulosic alternative to corn to produce ethanol on a much higher level that can meet some of the targets that we have through DOE and other national initiatives. But that said, revolutionary breakthroughs are needed to make the lignocellulosic biofuels a reality. It's very easy to stand here on stage and say that we can realize lignocellulosic biofuels to a level equal to that of corn ethanol, but we still have not done that yet. DOE has funded some pilot programs that are leading the way for industrial innovation and proof of concept developments in realizing lignocellulosic biorefineries, but we're still a long ways away from being able to produce them on a cost competitive basis with gasoline and corn ethanol. And until you reach that point, we're never going to meet the targets that we need to displace a significant section of fossil fuels. And that's what the Bioenergy Research Centers and JBEI are all about. So the JBEI at a snapshot, we've already heard mentioned to Jay Kiesling, and he is the PI of the Joint Bioenergy Institute. It is a very targeted, focused research organization to solve the lignocellulosic biofuel problem. We've actually taken a startup company approach. That is not to say that we are a startup company. I need to specify that. We are DOE funded. So whenever we mention that, we have to give a great caveat that we're just taking the approach and the philosophy of a startup company, and we're not actually, going to be talking to venture capitalists about funding us in the near future. But it is highly focused, and it is a single operation. And that distinguishes us not only from EBI, but also from the other bioenergy research centers. And I'll get into that differentiation a little bit later. We are organized into 4 science and technology divisions. They're each, the 3 science divisions basically represent feedstocks, and that's headed by Wolf Romer. The second is deconstruction, and that's led by myself. And the third is fuel synthesis, and that is led by Jay Kiesling. We have a technology division that is led by Paul Adams. And basically, we think it's the ties between the 3 science divisions supported by a technology division that will actually realize this integrated focus approach to lignocellulosic biofuels. It is also a partnership. We have 3 DOE national laboratories, and whenever you say that, that either causes a shudder down everyone's back, or if you're in the know, a great sense of trepidation, but I am here to tell you it's working. The 3 national laboratories are Lawrence Berkeley, Sandia, and Lawrence Livermore. We have 2 universities in partnership with this institute, and that is Berkeley and Davis. And then we have 1 foundation, and that is the Carnegie Institute at Stanford as part of it. And that is the core team that forms JBEI. We also have a very strong focus on industry partnerships and commercialization of the things that we realize within JBEI. We really want to make a return on the taxpayers' investment on the research dollars that are at JBEI, because this is a taxpayer-funded program. And so we are here to make our lives better. And so we really need to transition to the commercial sector in order for that to occur. So the JBEI mission is basically to develop alternative transportation fuels to meet future demands while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We are looking at ethanol initially, but we are looking far beyond ethanol in terms of biofuel candidates that are more like gasoline, if not a straight biogasoline equivalent. We're going to pursue some of the real fundamental scientific questions in developing a toolbox that allows the implementation of these technologies to solve the lignocellulosic biofuel problem. I mentioned that we have 3 science divisions, and those are each tackling that problem that Chris equated to buckets. So we have 1 team that's looking at feedstocks, 1 team that's looking at taking those feedstocks and converting them into fuel intermediates, and then we're looking at converting those fuel intermediates into actual fuels. And we have some pictures here of like the plant cell walls, some enzymes that we're looking at. And we've also talked about the diversity in biofuels. Again, getting away from that single bullet solution that actually may be a little bit myopic. Maybe we need to take a look at a variety of fuels and a variety of candidates in order to make the inroads that we need to displace a significant amount of fossil fuels. So I did mention that we are at 1 facility. We are taking beneficial occupancy here in April. It's located just down the road in Hollis Avenue. And what's unique is that we are going to combine all the different researchers from all these different institutions into 1 coordinated research facility. We really think that getting the dialogue and the interplay between a cohabitated space with all these diverse scientists in 1 location is going to be a key enabler in meeting our milestones over a very short period of time. And it is really a sign of the institutional commitment from the national labs and the universities to really make it happen. And I also want to point out that we also have conference facilities, but most importantly in Berkeley, we also have secure parking of about 90 parking spaces, which is a key element for us as opposed to coming here and trying to park on campus, as I found firsthand through several tickets that I won't go into. So JBEI leverages the key capabilities of the partner institutions. I mentioned the 3 national labs, 2 universities, and the Carnegie Institute. But we are standing on the shoulders of some giants in the field of science and technology that are located around the Bay Area. And we really think that, in much the same vein as EBI, we are, very uniquely located to really take advantage of those resources and taking a new approach to solving lignocellulosic biofuels. And that includes a diverse set of skill sets around plant research, systems and synthetic biology, energy research, the Helios facility being one that's just being created, Imaging, which is a key component in trying to understand what changes can be made to the plant cell wall and what impact they have in processability and deconstruction of those plant cell walls. We need to have new diagnostic tools to be able to get a molecular level understanding of what's going on. Also, computation and nanoscience are also part of it. You may be asking, why nanoscience? Well, I would posit that everything that happens in biology happens at the nanoscale. And we really need to get some new insight and some new computational predictive techniques to really advance the field. And so I mentioned the interlocking approach. I just wanted to bring this up again. You'll see the main crux of the effort goes from sunlight to cars. And that goes basically sunlight into plants, plants into sugars, sugars into fuels. We tried to get a Prius on the far right car, but we couldn't find a good graphic of one. So please excuse me. It's what I drive, but you know, personal preference notwithstanding. We are standing on the shoulders of a very wide research portfolio within the DOE Office of Science. This is not a standalone program. There's going to be a high degree of synergy through the existing DOE programs that we can really draw from to the benefit of the nation. And then the cross-cutting technologies are going to basically enable the realization of that pipeline from plants to fuels. So just summary right now on the JBEI impacts. And these are what we hope to achieve. Again, this project is very new. We just started in October, and we haven't even occupied the building yet. But the research program is going on at the partner institutions currently, and we are on track to meet all the year one milestones currently, even before we ostensibly start in the centralized location. And basically, it comes down to elucidate and modify the plant cell wall structure and synthesis schemes, to develop efficient and cost-effective routes for deconstruction of lignocellulose with a minimum of impurities that can inhibit your biorefining operations downstream. We also want to engineer organisms that will enable the scalable production of biofuel and next-generation biofuels, and also to develop integrative technologies that will enable not only us, but the entire industry and the entire endeavor. And then, again, to develop this workbox that will be translated into an integrated science and technology base that will then be translated into the biofuels industry. And with that, thank you.
So our last panelist is Doug Cameron, who is the current Chief Scientific Officer at Coastal Ventures. Doug has been in the microbial space, in the microbiology space for a long, long time, just like everybody else on the panel, and graduated from Duke and then got a PhD from MIT, where he did a thesis on the metabolism of an ethanol-producing thermophilic bacterium. So he's probably one of the few venture capitalists where when scientists come in to talk to him, he actually knows more than they do about a topic. But in any case, after MIT, he went and became a tenured professor at the chemical engineering department at the University of Wisconsin, and then eventually made his way into the corporate world and became an investor at Coastal Ventures. So really, as much as anybody has had the opportunity to understand the full scope of the challenge that we face right now in terms of biofuel. So please welcome Doug.
So I too thank the organizers for inviting me here, and what I'm going to do is try to give you the investor and some of the innovative perspective of what's going on in this field. And I thought probably no better way to do this than to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've been investing in. So I'll start with a slide that we use at Coastal Ventures. Some of you may have seen it, but it's a summary of our investment portfolio, and I'll give you a flavor of the sort of things we're interested in. So first of all, we're interested in technologies that address issues related to oil, the depletion of oil and the need for liquid fuels. And this is where a lot of our various biofuels investments in both corn ethanol, but cellulosic and future fuels fall. And these are the names of some of the companies that we've invested in this space. And a few of them I'll say a little bit more about later, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to say that they range from somewhat conventional corn ethanol companies all the way to probably the most cutting-edge types of fuel and biofuels companies that, at least that we can find. We also address issues related to problems associated with coal. Coal is our major source of power in the United States. It causes a lot of greenhouse warming gases. And so we're interested in investments that allow us to replace coal, or as Vinod sometimes says, how do we fossilize fossil fuels? You know, get rid of them. So some of the companies that we have in this space are photovoltaic companies. Osra is a thermal solar company that's going to replace energy plants with using energy from the sun. Infinia is a Stirling engine company. We have geothermal and other related companies. We're also interested in investments in the area of efficiency. How do we make things more efficient? Electrical efficiency as well as mechanical efficiency. So here are companies that are in the area of batteries, of energy storage, of efficient lighting systems for the home, as well as efficient homes. Living Homes is a LEED certified green home company. PAX is a mechanical efficiency company that is spun out of Berkeley. And then we're interested in materials, both kind of tools for doing things, water, plastics, and building materials. And these are some of the companies that we've invested in these spaces. I'll say a word or two about a couple of these later. But a couple of water companies, QOS and Nano H2O, and then Dratz Sagetis are chemical companies. Solodyme is a glass company, electrochromatic glass, and Calera is a green cement company. 7% of all CO2 that's generated comes from cement manufacture. This is a company that avoids that. So this is our current portfolio. What I want to do is say a few words about how we think about biofuels and some of the trends that we see happening in the biofuels space. So focus kind of a little bit on the material that's in those bottom light bulbs down there. This is what biofuels technology is today. Biofuels are, by and large, primarily either ethanol or biodiesel. Ethanol in the United States is made by the yeast fermentation of corn. In Brazil, it's sugar cane. And that's the major sources of ethanol currently in the world today. Biodiesel is something that we're not quite so excited about, but it comes from soybean oil in the United States, rapeseed oil in Europe, and palm oil in other parts of the world, and it's a chemical transformation. So this is the current world's biofuels situation. But we're huge believers in innovation, and we see an enormous amount of innovative solutions to come up with new ways to do this and significantly better ways to make biofuels. And so we like to call this kind of the innovative ecosystem, and we sort of like to try to fertilize that ecosystem with funding. So there's a lot of work being done, as you've already heard, in improving feedstocks, harvesting practices. You've heard that there are fuels other than ethanol, and some of them, much more attractive to the current infrastructure than ethanol. There are a number of very exciting processing approaches. I think the groups that you've heard talk today are primarily focused on what I would say is sort of a sugar-based technology where you take biomass and break it down into sugars and then rebuild those sugars back into things. But there are also approaches where you can take the biomass and convert it into something called syngas, which is carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And there are biological and chemical ways to use syngas to convert to fuels. And then a third major approach is pyrolysis, where what you do is you heat the biomass up until you get what's called a bio-oil. And there are ways to make improved bio-oils that have very interesting properties. So we're interested in investing in all of these areas, in various permutations of these areas. As I said, systems integration is important. And I'll give you one example of systems integration. The petroleum industry makes fuels, but they also make almost all of the chemicals and materials that we use in the world. And so we feel that as the biorefinery or as the bio-based renewable industry develops, we're also going to need to look at how do we make the chemicals that we use in the world from renewable resources. And one of the reasons that the oil industry does that is that they get a substantial amount of their profit. A lot of their profit margin comes from these chemicals. What's also interesting is that the carbon footprint of the chemical manufacturer is much worse than the carbon footprint of fuel manufacture. And so to use bio-based materials to make chemicals, it's maybe not as big of a market, but certainly the carbon footprint, you can really address it a lot better even than with some of the fuels. So I'm not going to belabor this slide. You've seen versions of this slide before already, but these are examples of various bio-derived fuels that I know of people working on. So ethanol is just one of those molecules on that, and this is sort of the menagerie of different types of critters out there that people are working on. There's probably a few more. This is how I like to think of the current biofuels world. The current world is we have biorefineries, we have oil refineries, each of them make their own product, and then we make ethanol, and at some sort of blending facility, close to a big city, we blend the oil and the gasoline together. And it leads to a lot of inefficiencies that you have to do it this way. So the current corn ethanol plants are like this. These are biorefineries. They make their ethanol. They have to transport it by rail or by pipe to some blending facility where it's blended into E85 or E10 or whatever. The trend that I'm seeing, and I think from listening to the other speakers, is trying to simplify the infrastructure a little bit more. So what if instead of that scenario, you had this scenario where you had a petroleum refinery and a biorefinery, and now what you could do is put your fuel into the petroleum, put your biofuel into the petroleum right at the refinery, either somewhere in the refinery or right at the refinery. And this is the kind of thinking that's leading to the development of several companies that have sprung out of the California area. Gevo is a next generation biofuels company focused on butanol and monomers, dimers, trimers of butanol. Just moved from Pasadena to Denver a couple weeks ago. Amyris is a company that was founded at Berkeley and is one of the leading companies that's making hydrocarbon-like fuels by fermentation. And then LS9 is another company. It's just moved to South San Francisco. Again, using fermentation instead of to make ethanol, to make basically gasoline or diesel fuels by fermentation. So this is a trend that we think is quite exciting. Now, if you push this to the extreme, maybe you don't even need the biorefinery at all. And here's an example of maybe we can put petroleum and some sort of plant-based material directly into some oil refinery of the future or some modified oil refinery. Oil refineries are capable of dealing with a wide range of different types of crudes. They're extremely versatile at adapting to crudes. Maybe they can adapt to some sort of bio-oil input as well. And so we have recently invested in a company called Kior, which is setting themselves up in Houston. And what they're doing is they call it biomass catalytic cracking. They're experts in the oil refinery. They're experts in catalysts that are used in oil refining. And their vision is make various types of catalytically derived pyrolysis oils from biomass, put them right into the front end of an oil refinery, and you've now got bio-based content in your gasoline, but in a very simple way that hasn't caused you to change your infrastructure a whole lot. And of course, you can always test that by using something like C13 labeling to see, what fraction of that oil is bio-based. Now, I said before that if you look at the current model of both the oil refinery and the biorefinery, chemicals is a major product of these refineries. In volume, it's not so big, but in terms of dollars, it's pretty significant. All chemicals that we use today are pretty much made from this list of building blocks that come from petroleum. This is the petrochemical industry. These are the building blocks. As we go to a bio-based economy, people are trying to figure out what is a new set of building blocks that we can derive from renewable resources. And this is an example of one set. It's not a perfect set, but it could be one. The DOE identified this one. This is already starting. This is from the Financial Times, a full-page ad from June 25th, 2007. A Brazilian company says, we're now going to make polyethylene from ethanol. So we're instead of making it from ethylene, which is the way it's been made for years, we're going to make it from ethanol. Polyethylene is the biggest volume plastic used in the world. A couple weeks after this, Dow Chemical put a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal saying they were going to do it as well. Khosla Ventures is funding companies in this general space, so we have a couple recent investments. Sagetis is working on using renewable resources to make plastics and chemicals. Draths is using renewable resources to replace chemicals that are currently made from benzene and aromatic type molecules. And my last slide is we have some really thought-provoking white papers on our website. If you haven't looked at them, I think that we try to push the envelope as hard as it can be pushed and explore things that a lot of other people don't explore. And so I would strongly encourage you to look at them. The white papers tend to be working drafts, so they change from time to time as we update them. But two of them that we've recently put out there that are quite provocative is one is where will biofuels and biomass come from? And the other one is called Biofuels Pathways. And in this where will biofuels and biomass come from, we address the recent science papers on land use. We also propose some scenarios that we think are plausible where we can, by 2030, replace all of our petroleum in the United States by renewable-based fuels and show scenarios where we can do this without using any more land than is currently being used today to produce ethanol. So some provocative things, I'm sure people will argue with them, but we like to kind of lay it right out there, and I encourage you to take a look. Thanks.
So along those lines, there's been a lot of criticism recently of biofuels in terms of the upstream impacts, and it's something that we talked a little bit as a panel about, and at a time where biofuels are 3% of the fuel supply, and Doug is suggesting that they could be 100%, I think there's some question out there about whether or not this is really feasible, whether or not this has the kind of impacts that are a showstopper. And so there are some recent studies that were done on carbon, and I think a lot of people have responded very strongly to those, saying, well, then that's sort of it for biofuels. But I wanted to ask Chris and Madhu in particular what their take was on that report recently, and also how they think we're going to navigate some of these issues moving forward.
Well, the Searchinger paper in Science was a very important study. It pointed out that something that's actually relatively well known, that most of the carbon is in the soil, and traditional agriculture results in a reduction in the amount of carbon stored in soils, and therefore, if for example, you cut down the rainforest and burn it and put corn there, and you'll release rather large amounts of carbon, and the net benefit from that type of biofuel will never offset the losses to soil carbon. That paper also noted, and I have no disagreement with that proposal. I would just point out that that's somewhat a straw man. You might say it was a rather extreme scenario. But the paper goes on to point out that or to claim at least, that what's happening with the use of increasing amounts of farmland in the U.S., for example, or for production of grain ethanol, is that the increasing demand around the world for food is being met by production elsewhere, and the paper claimed that production is results from development of undeveloped land for biofuel production elsewhere in the world. I don't know if it's possible for me to, could I have my slides up again? I didn't know you were going to ask this, but I do have a couple of slides I'd just like to show. So we think it's a very interesting and provocative paper, and I would say that in the context of the EBI, we certainly want to understand whether there's, to what extent there are issues of displacement, and I think Madhu may be able to comment on this better than I can, but I just want to first make a couple of points. This slide shows something, this shows U.S. corn exports, or use actually. So what it shows is that, and it's a projection, a recent USDA projection out beyond 2015. So what it actually shows is that U.S. corn exports are at an all-time high at a time when we're using 20% of the land in the U.S. for fuel production. And so the fuel production is the gray part of that figure, and you can see that it's gone from very little to quite a major use. But it has not affected our use of corn for any other purpose as yet, including, as I noted, exports. And you can see that in the USDA projection, that continues far into the future. And this slide also shows something that's highly relevant, which is the reason that's possible is that this slide is showing that since 1980, the use of land for crop production in the United States dropped from around 300 million acres to 250 million acres, and is projected to remain that way quite far into the future. And so it reflects a very strong disconnect between the basic idea that somehow all the land is already being used, and therefore to make more agricultural product, you have to bring more land into production. In fact, it's generally not true. The most conservative ecologist would acknowledge there's at least 500 million hectares of degraded land around the world, degraded meaning land that has been used for agriculture and has fallen out of production. The FAO estimates up to 2 billion hectares of land around the world. And so I would also point out that one of the problems in agricultural production has been that the developed world has been subsidizing agriculture to the tune of something in the order of $300 billion a year in the EU and the US. The net result has been that corn, 30% of farm income roughly is subsidies in the developed world. And commodities are sold below the cost of production. And they're generally, because they're overproduced, they're dumped elsewhere in the world below the cost of production. That in turn has suppressed the development of agricultural economies elsewhere in the world, so that, for example, in Africa, corn production yield is only 20% approximately that of the US on a per acre basis. And to give you an example of what a small investment in agriculture can do to productivity, there was an article recently in Chemical Engineering News which pointed out that 3 years ago in Malawi in Africa, 5 million people were entirely dependent on grain imports for their food. And 3 years ago, the Malawi government made a small investment in supporting, subsidizing seed purchases and fertilizer. And today, Malawi is a net exporter of food. So the notion that somehow all the land is being used is a very bad notion, and that the only way to expand productivity is to cut down the forests is a very bad idea. I have the next slide. I just want to, in that respect, point out something about what is really driving the expansion of acreage into undeveloped land. This slide shows soybean oil imports, and you probably can't see it, but if you just focus, for example, on the pink area, the pink area is showing India's soybean oil or soybean imports, and you can see that in 1995 they didn't import anything, and today they're one of the major importers. The gray bar is China's imports. And you can see a very similar thing. In 1990, they had none, and today they're a major importer. And if you ask, where is that import coming from? The gray bar in this case is Brazil. By contrast, the green shows the United States soy production has remained actually flat. And so what's actually happening, and the major driver for the land development, at least in Brazil, is demand for protein in the expanding economies elsewhere in the world. And it actually has nothing to do with biofuels at present. So it's not to say, something bad might not happen in the future, but I think that there's a kind of a misunderstanding of what it is that's actually driving food prices and the use and the expansion of land into the forests. And I would also point out that, well, maybe I'll just stop there. Do you want to say anything, Madhu?
So let me just add to what Chris has said. Conceptually, what the article was pointing out is a valid concern that we could be displacing land which is in forests and grasslands and converting them to produce the food that the U.S. and other developed countries are using to produce biofuels. My concern really is whether we have the information at this point to be able to make the kinds of assessments that are made in that article, because there is we don't know the impact of changes in food prices on acreage changes in developing countries, or really even in the U.S., to be able to say for certainty how an increase in the price of corn is going to affect the amount of acreage that's going to come in is very difficult, particularly when talking about developing countries. And if you really look at some of the assumptions under which the article had its estimates, they were using estimates from the 1990s in how historical estimates of how land use has changed over time to project for the next 30 or 40 years. And so there's, I think the magnitudes still have to be investigated, but it is a possibility, but whether it's going to be as severe as was pointed out in the article is something that we don't have good data for right now.
Thanks. So something that was also mentioned was with JBEI and EBI focusing on the cellulosic challenge, that this is something that we've been focused on for many, many years. And it seems that it's always been somewhat sort of tantalizingly close to coming to fruition, which is being able to use cellulosic materials for fuels. Now there are a lot of efforts going into that space, and I think one of the questions for you, Blake, and also for you, Doug, are how far away are we from that reality, and what remains as challenges for us to overcome?
Well, there clearly are still technological and scientific challenges, but in my introduction you heard I've been working, or I've at least been associated with this area for a long time. There was a burst of funding in the late 70s and early 80s, and then from about 1982 until about 2 years ago, this was no man's land for research. So the only people that I know of who worked in this area were the absolute true believers who just, persistently believed it, probably had to write dozens and dozens of grant proposals for, a pittance of dollars. So there was really not very much funding in this. So when people say people have been working on it for a long time, they've been working on it, but it hasn't been worked on aggressively or seriously for very long. If we don't do it this time, we have no excuses. Now we've got significant money from companies like BP, significant dollars from the Department of Energy, significant venture capital money is going in. I mean, this is one of the hottest areas in venture capital. A dozen or so very, very innovative companies have started up in this space. This is the field for the top grad students, of the last few years. Before, I don't think you could get grad students to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Now you're getting the absolute top ones begging to work in this area. We regularly are getting phone calls from the top MBAs out of Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford, all wanting jobs in this area. So again, I can't predict whether, we're going to do it this time, but the rate of energy innovation is significantly different than it's been before. We have a plant, Range Fuels, that's building a production facility right now. Another company, Moscoma, that has 3 or 4 sites picked out, and they're building facilities. So this is the time for it to happen, if it's going to happen, I think.
Well, I would say it depends on how you define reality in terms of how long it will take. Some would argue that it's already happening. If you take a look at the corn ethanol refineries that are being built, it's basically going to double the capacity from what it is now within the next 18 months. That's going to be a huge influx of ethanol into the transportation fuel market. And we can debate whether that's a good or a bad thing from a sustainability and environmental thing associated with corn. JBEI is partnering with the Pacific Ethanol, which is establishing a West Coast biorefinery to establish a 10 million gallon a year pilot plant for cellulosic biofuels in the next 3 years. DOE's funded the first generation of cellulosic biorefineries that are probably going to very quickly match the current levels of biodiesel production in the United States. So, it depends on, are we talking about 100% displacement of gasoline or just staying on target and maybe a little bit beyond target? And if the technology innovations occur and the price point becomes competitive with gasoline and corn ethanol, it will happen. And we're not even talking about the impact of a carbon cap and trade or a carbon tax that's associated with the emissions profile of several industries. So I really think that, again, if we fail this time, we have no one to blame but ourselves. I wasn't around for Biofuels 1.0, as Harvey Blanche calls it, but we're hopeful that Biofuels 2.0 will be a resounding success. I do, however, want to point out, just to get a grain of perspective in everybody's minds, and I think Doug did a great job of this at the 1 p.m. Keynote session, that we're talking about significant investment, or at least it seems like a significant investment in the biofuels arena of just recent terms, from both venture capital, government, and private capital. But if you put it in perspective of the investment that was made over fuel cells, in solar, and we're not even talking about life sciences, there's other sectors of the energy market, it pales in comparison. And so we are asking a lot of biofuels researchers for relatively little that's been invested in them over the same period of time. And I think that we cannot be dissuaded by some of the popular hysteria about genetically engineered crops and the melting forest scenario until we try them out. And not that we're going to try out a melting forest scenario, but that we're actually going to try out genetic engineering of crops and actually take a rational scientific approach to solving this problem and not a knee-jerk reflex to some unknown fear. And that's just my humble opinion as a scientist. That's something that we need to really exercise a high degree of caution and very rigorous scientific thought in what we pursue, how, and why. And we have not even scratched the surface of what's available in the genomics age. And I would also posit that that is one of the things that's strikingly different between Biofuels 1.0 and now, is the explosion of genomic technologies and synthetic biology. I think will get new insight and new technological innovations that we haven't even thought of yet. And I really think that that is going to be the key enabler to making it a very successful replacement to fossil fuels.
And following up on that question, when you look at the, in your answer, Blake, when you look at the amount of dollars flowing into this space, $50 million a year to EBI or $10 million a year plus to JBEI, it obviously pales in comparison to $44 billion in profit for a quarter for a single oil and gas company. And we can only presume that a significant portion of that is being poured back into research and development for advanced systems to extract oil. Do you feel confident that we are moving, that we have a sufficient amount of investment in this space to move toward the kind of goals that we need to get to, or do we need dramatically more investment in this space to get there?
In my humble opinion, just as a private citizen now and not a representative of anything else, because I'd probably get in trouble if my boss is in the crowd. I really think that this is a seed that we need to take advantage of and an opportunity that we need to take advantage of. But it's going to take some intestinal fortitude on the part of the policymakers and the funding institutions, both within private, federal, and other funding sources to really make it happen. I think we have a great opportunity to really prove that it can be done in a feasible fashion. But to get the widespread displacement and the production levels needed to really make an impact on CO2 emissions, it's going to take resources that the current funding profile cannot even touch. And I really think that it's going to, if we really want to get to 100 billion gallons of renewable fuel a year, the funding profile that we have now just isn't going to be able to do it. So it's going to be a significant amount of investment over the next 10 to 20 years.
And Madhu, you were talking a bit about resource allocations and how you use, what the impacts are going to be upstream and downstream. But there's also an impact, which is the impact of regulation and whether or not we approach this in a brute force way, which is an RFS or something like that, or whether we try and do it in a more nuanced way, which is a low carbon fuel standard and other sorts of integrated programs. You'd mentioned that we need to think about how to integrate those things. Do you have a sense of how we can move towards the actual advanced biofuel world as opposed to just the biofuel world with reasonable speed? And should it be that we, are there enough incumbent forces and enough sort of political forces that we need to do it in a brute force way, or should we be thinking much more about these nuanced approaches, and how do you think we should go about that?
Well, my sense is that brute force approaches turn out to be wrong and costly eventually, and we have to develop approaches that work through the market, that create the right incentives, and allow people to find the cheapest way to comply with various objectives that we might have, and if we've created the right policies to do that. And so even though, for example, we have this renewable fuel standard, which is going to require 22 billion gallons of advanced biofuels by 2022, it looks a little bit difficult that we'll be able to actually meet that, or it's a challenge that we have to undertake to actually get to that level. And there are waivers in our current Energy Policy Act that would allow us to, if we can't do that with some penalties, we can continue down the path of corn ethanol for some more time. In contrast to that, a better approach would be to actually have, for example, to price fuels based on their carbon content, and thereby create incentives at all levels of the production process to be using low carbon methods, less energy intensive methods to do that. Also, the earlier question that we were talking about, what happens if we reduce carbon emissions in the US, but it leads to more carbon emissions in other countries? And that's a problem. In order to resolve that, we essentially need global carbon caps. We need participation by developing and developed countries where everything is being priced on a carbon basis, and so it creates incentives not to cut down forests in other countries as well. And that would be a much, if we really want to deal with climate change, that would be one approach to do that. Whether we have the political will, I think hopefully there's enough momentum, at least in the U.S., and there's recognition of that we might have that with a change in administration. I don't know globally if we can get India and China to agree to that, but that would be the way to go.
And earlier, Doug, you had put up a slide that was talking about the different pathways that you might take to get to different products, and you actually made several investments in a lot of different pathways to what might be similar end products. The jury is probably still out on what those end products will be. Do you think there's going to be room for all of those different pathways, given that when we look at a lot of commodity industries, these industries tend to move towards standards in processing and may differentiate based on feedstock or end product or whatnot. But if we're going towards similar products, is there going to be room for those different pathways? And if so, what different pathways do you think will be able to compete in this space, and how long will it be before some of that convergence happens?
Yes, so we think that there's room for a number of these to be successful, multiple pathways, multiple fuels to be successful. I mean, if you look at gasoline or diesel fuel, there are quite complex mixtures of things already. However, we do feel that as time goes on, of course, these are going to converge, but we just don't think anybody can really predict what the absolute best solutions are. So we think there'll be a lot of good solutions, but maybe in the 20, 25-year time frame, some of the better ones are going to start shaking out, and you're not going to have, such a huge number. It's almost kind of like the Cambrian explosion or something in evolution. We've got a lot of these new species that are around. Many of them will last for quite a while, but after a few years, a few of them will die out, and you'll settle in on some standards. So we expect that a lot of the companies we're investing in, multiple companies will be successful.
So last question, then we can open up to the floor so that we can ask a few questions from everyone else. But you had also mentioned, Doug, that this focus on being able to integrate these technologies into existing infrastructure, and that there's probably a pathway there to do that, and that it's important to be able to figure out how to make use of the existing infrastructure. We heard it on the prior panel as well. Do you think there's room, and I guess I'll ask this of you, Chris, and others can chime in, but do you think there's room for other attributes or attributes such as things like biodegradability or less toxic emissions that would mean that we don't rely on those on integration alone, but that we're actually capturing the value of those things? And it's sort of a two-pronged question. One is, do we have to integrate in order to make this happen? And the other is, can we capture some of the value of those attributes? And does that mean that we can actually go down separate pathways because we're creating new and different markets?
I'm probably not the right person to answer that. My general impression as a non-expert would be that things such as the renewable fuel standard can be written to incorporate the value of other attributes, but perhaps Madhu can answer that better.
Well, the way the renewable fuel standard is, it does, it is associated with a greenhouse gas cap or greenhouse gas reduction targets, but those targets are really just matching up with the standards. So, for example, the first one is that we should be able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20%, and that would be achieved if we were to, in fact, do the corn ethanol switch. On average, we'd be able to reduce it, but setting the standards is one thing, and getting people to do what's needed to get to that standard is another thing. And so how do you create the incentives for that to happen? And so, one way is through the price mechanism. If we were to modify our subsidy so that it's not just 51 cents for any gallon, but it's higher for cellulosic and a little bit lower for corn ethanol. If it's inversely related to the amount of carbon intensity of the fuel, all of those things would help in achieving that standard at a lower cost than otherwise.
I see the problem in this, in that, I don't know if this is on, that in the Energy Act of 2007, the goals for advanced fuels are quite aggressive, actually, 60% reduction in greenhouse gases for the advanced fuels, but the mechanism by which that reduction is going to be calculated is unspecified. It's just the language, as I could read it, says that the EPA will decide what that means in practical terms, and so I think that reflects the fact that in trying to put together that bill, they were not able to resolve the technical issues associated with how you attribute value to other aspects, such as environmental aspects. And so I think there's going to have to be a lot more evolution of our thinking about how to capture or attribute economic value to ecosystem services and the environment more broadly.
Any other comments, or should we go to Q&A? So questions. I know we don't have very much time left. In fact, I think we're 20 minutes over, but I think we started half an hour late, so we got 10 minutes at least. No questions.
There's one in the back.
is that people were telling us you're causing too much pollution, so you can't burn that crop anymore. So I'm curious about some of these grass crops, whether or not there's a similar cycle and potential negative feedback from others who don't like smog during the year.
Well, the perennial grasses that are being considered as biofuel crops are definitely not burned.
So I mean, just in terms of, you know, it is true that the price of corn has gone up from 2 to 5, and in some ways that is driven very much by the demand for corn for producing ethanol. And as long as there are profits in the ethanol industry to be made, it's going to push up the price of corn until finally those profits come down to zero. So, and that's essentially in some ways what we're seeing. And as the price of gasoline goes up, the price of ethanol can go up and the price of corn will go up. So those are some of the economic drivers.
It's even a bigger feedback loop than that. In that same CNE News article that Bruce Dale wrote against food versus fuel debate, what's lost is the impact of the elevated gasoline prices on everything, right? Because you have to transport it, you have to distribute it, and so it's hard to decouple what the component is of the corn demand versus gasoline prices in real terms. But it's something that needs to be addressed. I'd also like to point out that we've talked about perennial grasses and corn as potential feedstocks here for ethanol production, but it needs to be a much wider conversation around ag residues, short rotation woody crops, municipal solid waste, and everything else. It's much more of a canonical ensemble of feedstocks to really supplant a huge portion of fossil fuel consumption and gasoline consumption in the United States. And there have been a lot of studies done that have taken a look at the rotation of corn and soy and no-till practices to really minimize the impact of that kind of turnover rotation in the system that I think my family adheres to in outside of Lincoln that is sustainable. And I think that will also lead the way for perennial grasses and maybe a combination of short rotation woody crops with grasses that will develop a huge resource of sustainable biomass in a very reasonable fashion.
A couple more questions back here.
Yeah, well, my question goes more for, we've seen that biofuels compete with food in terms of land use. So I wonder what's the opinion of the panel on growing feedstock in the sea, so we can avoid competition for other types of land use, and also avoid depletion of the rainforest, like what's happening in Brazil right now, that they're cutting down rainforest to grow more soil and sugarcane, and also be in the sea a place where there are smoother conditions than in the land.
So I think the question is about, did you get the question, Doug?
I got part of the question. So, you know, one of the areas that is getting a lot of attention these days is algae. It's something that we haven't invested in yet because there are a lot of we haven't quite seen a compelling case yet, but there are quite a few groups that are talking about growing algae in various places, such as the desert, on wasteland, but also in the ocean. So there are 3 or 4 proposals out there on different ways to grow algae in the ocean. So that would be one way to make use of the sea.
I just want to, if I could address the comments. First of all, no rainforest is being cut down to grow sugarcane. The total production of sugarcane in Brazil takes place on about 3.5 million hectares, which is a tiny little piece of the land. It's true, however, that soybean production, as I showed in several slides, is expanding very rapidly, but that's driven by the increased economic activity in the developing world, and they're trying to increase the amount of protein in their diet. And of course, the soybean is not used directly usually in their diet, but it's being fed to animals in a very inefficient conversion process. So the FAO has noted that the amount of well, first of all, about 30% of the land in the world is used to grow ruminants, and the FAO has noted that the greenhouse gas emissions from production of ruminants for meat is actually equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions from all transportation fuels. So production of animal protein is actually one of the really major, it is the major driver for land use in the world. And to be honest, one of the most interesting sort of opportunities going forward is to sort of begin to modify how it is not all animal protein is equivalent. For example, fish and fowl are about 4 times more efficient than beef when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And so I don't know, maybe this is something that's going to have to come into the equation at some point in the future.
You know, and Chris, I've actually seen a number of scientific publications lately on engineering the rumen of sheep and beef cattle and things so that they don't make methane and greenhouse gases. I think, you know, they're more kind of basic research type projects, but they're kind of intriguing to look at.
Other questions? Okay.
The question that I would have is, how are the 2 institutes which are located on academic campuses, which are driven typically by professors that have to look for funding coming out of the National Science Foundation and other very academically driven type of organizations where we're looking at peer review, where we're looking at the most cutting edge research, how are those institutes able to actually help the translation of the science through the sheer magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with? Well, understanding, if you're just taking the ethanol example as one case in that point, we're producing about 5% of the current consumption of ethanol, or current consumption by gas in terms of ethanol, and this is already stretching the logistical issues that we're having in the country. So I think one of the issues here is that we're not only necessarily looking for a great new technology which really works well in a test tube or in a lab scale type of a thing, but we need to find a process, and we need to find processes that can work on the scale of city-sized, large-scale refineries, which is really orders of magnitudes more problematic than just accomplishing it in a lab. And what's done on those institutes to do this, not very glorious type of laborious process.
So, is it on? Okay. I'm a chemical engineer, so I consider those very glorious activities. But right. Well, but it can, and I guess it depends on the different mindset that you have upon what sector you're going after. JBEI is really trying to bring in as much as possible the industrial perspective to biorefining. We have an industrial advisory committee and a strategic advisory committee that are going to be able to offer their input as to what are some of the key barriers in cellulosic biorefineries. We will be looking to partner extensively with industry and outside relationships that don't fall under the umbrella of the DOE research profile to really do applied research to enable industry. And we've already proven that by partnering with Pacific Ethanol on a DOE grant for cellulosic biofuel production, that we're actually going to be kind of a troubleshooter on a technical side to some of the problems that they have as they try and scale up production from the 1 million gallon a year to 10 million gallon a year. So it's really, we're going to be rooted in fundamental science, but we're really trying to apply ourselves as much as possible to the problems that matter. And I think that's kind of one of the nuances that differentiates JBEI from a lot of the other institutes that are out there.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, EBI is also very basic. You know, maybe I didn't convey that, but both JBEI and EBI are not sort of commercialization oriented. We're trying to develop, you know, new insights that are quite far out beyond current R&D. And in fact, if you ask how will that ever affect the world, I think one of the really attractive things about the EBI, and in fact JBEI and their partnerships as well, is that we are partnered with a large chemical engineering organization that's really good at implementing large-scale applied chemical engineering. And so we have by the nature of the relationship, you know, we do have a close way of interacting so that we can understand what the issues of the long-term basic research issues of the industry are, and they in turn can see through these academic organizations what's possible, what the frontier looks like, you know, assuming we can have some successes in achieving some of the technical goals we're going after. So I actually think that EBI is a very interesting initiative, and I think it's the beginning of something that probably is going to be much more widespread. Indeed, during the previous panel, we had 3 energy companies talking about in part about their relationships with the academic sector, because to really address the problem that we're after, we need a partnership between the people who can implement large-scale energy production and the best minds that we can possibly bring to bear on the fundamental problems. And so I think that's what we have going on here at Berkeley now.
Okay, last question, I think.
This is a short question. There was a slide earlier, I think it was in Professor Khanna's presentation, showing that switchgrass could result in a negative carbon 75% figure, which I think would be very interesting if that meant for every ton of biofuel created, there would be 3/4 of a ton placed in the soil of stable carbon that could be placed again successive years over and over again. Is that what it meant, or was it something less encouraging than that?
Well, the switchgrass number looks very, it's deceptive, it's a little bit deceptive, and you know, it's large. The amount of carbon that can be sequestered per acre of land if you grow miscanthus is actually much larger than the amount that you can sequester if you grow switchgrass. But when you convert them into per gallon, the switchgrass, and you get much less switchgrass per acre of land than miscanthus. So when you convert them into per gallon, it actually looks like switchgrass, a gallon of ethanol produced from switchgrass sequesters more than miscanthus. But per acre of land, it's not the case. So, you know, because you get fewer gallons per acre, it looks like each gallon is doing a great deal. No, that's the other question. You know, there's a finite capacity for soil to sequester carbon, and once you've reached that capacity, it's not going to sequester more. And in fact, you sequester more, but at a declining rate, so that every year you're actually sequestering less until you reach that capacity. So this number that I gave was a very average number, and it doesn't mean that we can do this every year. We're going to eventually taper off and not be able to do much more.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and let's please thank all the panelists. And thank you to all the organizers for pulling off another great event. So, Henry, it's all yours.
So don't leave. Even you walking out right there. There's going to be a wonderful reception afterwards in just a minute. If you sit through 5 minutes of me talking and thanking everyone, we've got Rosemounts donated some wine, and we've got a nice food reception afterwards. But I just wanted to quickly thank a lot of people who made this happen. But before I did that, I just wanted to comment. This panel, this whole day, this symposium, BERC, EBI, JBEI, Helios, LBL. This is a new kind of thinking that's going on here, and I'm totally encouraged by it. That's part of the design of BERC, and that's part of redesigning this university. Is not just the incredible inventions that are going to come out of these labs and these new microbes, or a new way to break down a switchgrass. It's a new kind of process. It's a new kind of thinking. And that's part of this revolution. It's not just what comes out of it, it's how we do it. There's a horizontal nature to this hierarchy. There's a sharing Chris, you talk about letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And I would say part of those 1,000 flowers blooming is also them cross-pollinating, right? And making flowers that you didn't even know existed. So I consider us the gardeners, maybe, of that revolution. If I could be so bold to put BERC even on that platform, I think we're hopefully the next generation of you all, innovators and perhaps gardeners of these flowers, these grasses, these things that are going to meet the challenge that John Doerr spoke of and his new partner Al Gore spoke of. They're massive and they're intimidating, but I think Berkeley as the epicenter for a revolution, not just in technology, but in thought and in sharing is it. So with that, I want to congratulate 3 of our contest participants who kind of embody this new thinking and this kind of hope for the future. For those of you who handed in your voting forms, I really appreciate it. To me, that's one of the most exciting things, is to see what's on the horizon and what students are capable of. So we have 2 second-place winners here, and so I hope they're in the audience, but they'll be each receiving $500 for their efforts. And so without further ado, the runners-up are Aaron Kubison, poster number 13, water to water, waste to fuel. So come on down, Aaron. Or I'll write you a check. Someone will write you a check. Okay. Oh, Aaron, okay. Yeah, come on up, come on up. Congratulations. And our other second place recipient is Zach Norwood, distributed solar thermal combined heat to power. So Zach, you somewhere? We'll find you, we'll hunt you down, and we will pay you somewhere. And I'm very excited about our first place winner because Cyrus Wadia is really one of the pioneers here of this new kind of cross-pollination, this new gardening that we're doing. Cyrus founded a solar materials photovoltaic lab, and since then, Tom Khalil and Annie Ye, who run Big Ideas at Berkeley, which I consider to be, he's called it, the venture capital firm of this campus, kind of incubating these young ideas and bringing them to fruition. So we owe Tom and Annie a great debt of gratitude, but it's people like Cyrus who kind of took that charge and have run with it. And BERC is going to be founding a whole series of idea labs on climate policy, obviously the solar materials one is going full force, but we're going to be expanding that model and having lots of different student think tanks to incubate these new ideas. So Cyrus did a first inorganic nanoparticle solar cell with, was that copper selenide? Man, I've not taken chemistry for a while. Cyrus, you won. Where are you? Come on up, maybe? No? All right, well, someone tell him I paid him thousands of compliments. And so I want to thank our sponsors, particularly the Energy Biosciences Institute that really stepped up. They were our platinum level sponsor, and I'm thrilled to have you all on this campus. It's a tough process that we went through. I was a part of it, and through this summer, there's a tentativeness in Berkeley sometimes with change, even though we're considered so radical. And I think it's a testament to kind of the merits of this endeavor that they lasted through the skepticism. And I think that skepticism is healthy, and I hope it continues because you obviously embrace it. And there's no fear in that institute of hard questions. They're looking at them. And so thank you, EBI. Thank you, Chevron, Nathan and Violet David Foundation, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich Rosati, the Management of Technology Institute, Rosemount for all the wine. You guys are really going to appreciate that one. Helios, Environmental Energy Technologies Division, the Lawrence Berkeley Labs, New Resource Bank, Big Ideas at Berkeley, Nth Power, and Alyssa and Jonathan Harris. So thank you to our sponsors very much. Really appreciate it. We need you. You invest in the future. So, and if there's anyone else who wants to support more symposia we're here. You can find me. I'm very tall. You can hunt me down. So, and lastly, and hardly least, I want to bring up the people who made this happen. These are the student leaders who are meeting this challenge, and these are the members of BERC. So, the organizing team, if you wouldn't mind just coming up to stage, we want to thank you. Jit Bhattacharya, Ben Biddle, come on up. Ryan, Marion, Steph Gittler, Chris, Pooja, Michael Martin, Kayum, Rajat, Kevin, Ernesto, Susie, Matt Sieving, Naveen, Ryan Stanley, Kano, Max Way, Wilton Wright, Nina. Come on up, you guys. They have worked, I can't even tell you, there's an all-volunteer effort, and it's been a pretty beautiful day. So, to you all. And the co-chairs of this have not been sleeping much, and so we're going to pay them a little bit of gratitude. We have a few things here. So, Shannon Okuyama, Ariel Rock, and Jerome Fox are tireless. Come on up to the stage, please. Thank you all. Most of all, Ariel, because he has a child due any second now. His wife is at home with a baby, so we got you some cigars, and I hope you use them very soon. I'd like to receive one perhaps and be there to give you a hug. So thank you all for your hard work. You guys really, logistically, this is madness. This isn't the fun part. The fun part is coming up with the ideas and spending time talking about them. But they executed all the hard things that need to make this happen and put you all in the room so we can have this incredible conversation. So it's just huge. Seriously, thank you. And that's it. Come join us at the reception upstairs, and thank you all for coming today.